First of all, uhuru and good afternoon. How's everybody feeling? Everybody full? Okay, good. I appreciate everybody, not only for organizing this event and all of you for coming, but for accommodating, sometimes our overwillingness to accept invitations, and adjusting the schedule so I can go and then I'm gonna come back. So I appreciate all of that greatly. What I'm gonna do here is just go through sort of a condensed version of a much broader presentation, and hopefully it will still make sense. And then I think maybe we'll have a few minutes for some discussion, I hope. So I'll more or less go through it pretty quickly, and I think hopefully give us something to work with. Again, as usual, just situating colonialism as the fundamental idea here, or concept to deal with, or the issue or the struggle to deal with. And as has already been said, without the context of imperialism and colonialism, a lot of the discussions that we have and a lot of the analyses that are produced just simply don't make sense. I always keep thinking of Fred Hampton's, statement about we reach conclusions that don't conclude and answers that don't answer. So the title of this is just Colonialism and Mass Media, Propaganda and Psychological Warfare. Simply put, propaganda, public relations, and psychological warfare actually all have official definitions that are almost identical. And they basically just deal with an over-preponderance of a certain message that is designed to impose certain forms and frames of reference and patterns of thought onto subject people. And they use the terms in official academia, if that's important. They actually talk often about subjects and targets when discussing communication. And as we'll talk about briefly, they talk about communication in terms of weaponry, and something that I think is always good to consider. So again, colonialism is the foundation, always going back, to the greats like Frantz Fanon. Among many of the things that he said, he put it just simply: colonialism is the complete and total conquest of a land and people. That is all. I mean, it's a brilliant summary, and it allows for people to not be confused by all the fancy language and concepts, and to remember what is really at stake here: the complete and total conquest of a land and people. Jack O'Dell, and I was just reading his recently republished Reader, which I've always enjoyed, particularly, well, the readers knew, but his work I've always enjoyed. And one of the things that he talked about in identifying Black America specifically as an internal colony, which is, I think, something that just very briefly I want to say is very important when conceptualizing the way Black America and other groups held as captives within this country are dealt with. It's always important to not think of it in terms of pluralism and progress and democracy and freedom, and we went through slavery and then things have progressively gotten better and so on and so forth. That there is a set in stone pattern here that Jack O'Dell talks about in terms of, as he says here, in defining the colonial problem, it is the role of the institutional mechanisms of colonial domination which are decisive. Territory is merely the stage. So he was talking about putting Black America specifically back into a global context and reminding the world and ourselves, in fact, that the processes of imperialism that created European countries and African countries and Latin American countries have also produced internally colonized nations, subsumed and held within the state apparatus of the United States. Of course, indigenous nations are there, Latino and Chicano nations are there, and Black America is best conceived as a nation within a nation. So just wanted to, and he also said, by the way, he made a point that the so-called revolution of 1776 did not end slavery. So his point was the pattern had been set, and that proves that Black America is an internally held colony, a nation within a nation, that the so-called revolution didn't change those fundamental relationships. So media as psychic violence, Frantz Fanon talked about this as the primary component of colonization, that there was, of course, the physical brutality. You come in, you wipe out people, you wipe out those who resist, and then you wage psychic violence, which is necessary to maintaining colonial order once the physical component has been dealt with, all right? So he says, again, colonialism is the organization of the domination of a nation after military conquest. So what happens after you conquer people is the need to maintain the social order, and psychic violence, as he said, is essential to that. And I think that's important that we understand media, particularly in this context, as psychic violence. So media, culture, ideology, and military domination. As Chris Simpson, a great researcher at the University of Maryland, or formerly at the University of Maryland, now at American University, talks about, he's done some of the best work in excavating the true nature behind what we call communication studies or media studies. And he talks about, as they said in their own literature, that media are the fourth arm of the military, that they are to be manipulated to secure ideological victories over the colonies through the application of propaganda, and this was done internationally as well as domestically. And that public opinion is seen as an aggressive intervention in other states. And that's Harold Laswell, who's considered a founding father of communication studies and is often ignored by people who practice communication studies or who even teach within the field, precisely because what he was dealing with was a government-sponsored, private, corporate elite-sponsored study into the ways to manipulate populations. To get them to go to war, to support war, to assume all the ideas that are dominant within those who are in power. And he talked about it as an aggressive intervention. So the ideological function of U.S. Media in the United States have an ideological function, in the United States as well as around the world. My focus is the United States, so I want to be specific here so that we just don't, we can't automatically transplant analyses, wholesale, but it's a good place to start. The Colonial Pyramid, just again, the same thing I've been talking about, the process of colonizing this continent and developing this nation is based on enslavement and destruction of the fourth world, which is the indigenous nations that pre-exist this modern nation, and so on up the ladder it goes. And within that is this media apparatus that I often talk about, just going through it very quickly, which forms this, using these four tenets to sort of identify how media work ideologically in this country. Marx said that the original sin of capitalism is commodity formation, turning every and anything into a commodity. Greg Tate said that the original commodity of the United States was us, African people. And this, according to Downing and Husband and many others, but just focused specifically on media studies, formed what we call the conceptual original sin of the United States, or racism, or really this idea that you have to identify yourself against somebody else. So this is again why James Baldwin said, when a white man calls me nigger, I just ask him why you need me to be one. Because if I'm not the nigger you say I am, then you're not the white man you say you are, and then everything just collapses. And then, people like Amos Wilson and Marimba Ani have talked about that, as Amos Wilson said, it is a political necessity to destroy the African consciousness of colonized African people. So there's an assault permanently in place against Black America and other African populations as seeing themselves as having any connection to the African world. Some of the founding fathers, just very quickly, of this modern day propaganda, Edward Bernays is the one who is most popularly known as coining the term propaganda, or public relations rather, to clean up the word propaganda, which he said, I don't really see what the big deal is, but the Nazis took what we were doing here already and they made it something that the world sees now as negative, so we can't use propaganda anymore, so we call it public relations. And that's why when I say even in the classroom that public relations is just psychological warfare, people get sometimes uncomfortable, but that is ultimately what it is, and he said so himself. So if you don't believe me, then as always, you got to have your good white male sources. There's one. You don't have to believe me. He said it himself. And he talked also in terms of this in the context of an invisible government, that he said, we have an invisible government here. We give you elections. We give you votes. We give you concepts of yourself as having anything to do with this proper functioning of this society so that you don't rebel. But don't ever be confused that this is, and this is actually from the first paragraph of his book in 1920 called Propaganda, I think 1920 or 23, somewhere around there. He says, like, the first line is, we have an invisible government that is run by the upper echelons of the society, and don't you all be confused as to thinking that you have anything to do with this. And as he said, we can propagandize people to go to war, and then he's also said, so we needed to develop propaganda in peacetime, which is to keep people in order, in the same levels of control that you would otherwise need a military for. Then Walter Lippmann said, in his famous book of a similar era, Public Opinion, and I only bring it up here because to get to a point that I think actually Sister Asada just spoke to rhythmically, is that public opinion is established in the society to defend to defend the political position of those in power, and the stereotype is used as he said, a self-defense mechanism. We have to create propagandized versions of the people we are conquering, and he speaks specifically about Black people in this book, creating this idea that these people deserve the situation that they are faced with. And whether or not you think of him as, there's always debate about what he really meant. But the point is not what he meant, but it's the point of how studies that people produce are used by those in power. I publish, everybody in the academic world publishes, people outside the academic world publish, and we say whatever we want to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those in power will use the information for the reasons we have set it down. They will use it as a mechanism of study to protect their own positions in power. So we all can't get confused. A lot of us in academia think, well, I'm not colonized, I'm free, and I write real radical stuff and get it published and all this other stuff. Well, that's great, and that's fine. The 3 people who read the journal articles, 2 of them will be the people in power who will implement it for their benefit, and the rest of us just run around, claiming, making our CVs long and all that other kind of stuff. So propaganda has always been used. It's been used by everybody's side. We all use it. I'm engaged in it. We're all engaged in it. And depending on whether or not you think it's positive or negative, is just what side of the issue you're on. But those in power who've been writing about this for quite a while have said that propaganda is to be used, in this case, as subversion, which is the undermining or detachment of the loyalties of significant social groups and their transference to the symbols and institutions of the aggressor. Techniques include propaganda, violence, and manipulative persuasion. And the reason why I like that particular sentence is because, again, propaganda and violence are put in the same sentence. That media are not seen as some sort of separate and distinct item within the arsenal of those in power. They are part of that arsenal. They are one of the many arrows that can be pulled out of the quiver whenever necessary. But we can't ever be mistaken or convinced that media are somehow not important, that media are somehow ineffectual or powerless. They have tremendous power, and those in power use it to their advantage as much as possible. I also happen to just like this piece of propaganda. I think it came out against the United States invasion of the Philippines. It kind of speaks for itself. It says at the bottom there, it's your blood, doughboys, but no more, but more and still more is to be squeezed out if you keep invading us. Anyway. Information warfare, another term used simultaneously with psychological warfare, psychological operations, and so on. And by the way, you all saw that it just was reported that this was done to the senators in Afghanistan, right? They're still employing this. And in fact, Obama, this is another part of the presentation I didn't think to keep in, but Obama has kept Brian Whitman on as the chief military propagandist from the Bush administration. He's doing the same exact things in developing this. The message force multipliers, they're called. The paid military elite who are put on TV as consultants and experts and pundits to tell everybody why war is necessary and why war is good. And then as Theodore Adorno said, the imposition of recognition as a substitute for liking or agreement with something. DMX just said if you feed people, I think they're children, if you feed people dog stuff long enough, they'll put barbecue sauce on it. But it's the same concept that they impose in us this idea that because we recognize a message that we must then agree with it. And we don't distinguish often enough recognition from like or agreement. And that leads to, that. Right, so they just massively propagandized us. And if you read their literature about the Obama campaign, they called him, not only did he win Brand of the Year in 2008, but they talked openly about branding him. He beat Nike and Apple in 2008, and then Rahm Emanuel talked openly about we brand him and we put him everywhere. We want him everywhere, specifically so that his detractors can't keep up with all of his arguments. That was an actual strategy that they talked about. Put him on this show, in this magazine, everywhere, so that nobody's really paying attention to what he's actually saying. They just see him, and therefore they assume that they like him, and then they go and vote for him. And then after the election, they don't know where to latch on to be critical, so they just keep supporting him, and so on and so on. It's a brilliant strategy, and it works. And you ask students all the time, did you see Obama? Yeah, I saw Obama. What did he say? I don't know. It doesn't even matter. He looked good. He sounded good. Black man, brother, all this other kind of stuff. And it's like, and then, again, as we all talked about, the well-meaning white folks say, oh, but, it's so good. And don't you feel good to have a black man? And, we supported him, so therefore we're not liberals and or guilty. And it creates this really destabilizing, and that's not the stagnant, it forces stagnation on us. So that's why Black is Back is so important. So Naomi Klein got very popular with her book, The Shock Doctrine, and it's a very good book, very important book, but I always like to say that, again, Fanon had been talking about that for 40 years. Psychic violence is what he meant by shock doctrine, and he said the same thing. You impose horrible conditions on people, or you take advantage of the natural ones, and then you can impose your messages and create the kind of conditions that you will find politically and economically viable or beneficial. And then what they did is she talked about they used CIA techniques, and the CIA was one of the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, was one of the major funders of the Foundation of Communication Studies Research. So they wanted to find out, how do you dislocate and distort communication on an individual and collective basis? The shocking moment is often helpful here. They're in a moment of crisis and stress, so you just start hitting them with certain messages and they will fall right in line, as she says here. But again, because of Fanon and because of that sort of line of analysis that goes through imperialism and colonialism, we know that racial oppression within a colony is natural. And then we have to ask the question that I think Naomi Klein doesn't ask, which is specific to our condition here: when has African America not been in a state of shock? When have we not been in a state where the shock doctrine could be deployed against us constantly since our time in this country? So if we just look at brief picture here of African history in the United States, it's pretty clear that from the beginning of enslavement and the Klan and lynching and then mass incarceration and police brutality, we have been in a permanent state of crisis against which a shock doctrine technique could always be easily deployed and used against us. Also before, by the way, not only modern propaganda studies, but also again before Naomi Klein is Du Bois's discussion of the propaganda of history, where he said that its fidelity against the Negro since emancipation in this land is where we face one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings, an effort involving universities, history, science, social life, and religion, and to which I would only add mass media. But Du Bois's point was evident in the early 1930s, that propaganda of history has been part of a collective of weapons used against Black and African people here and around the world. He also was a proponent of semi-colonialism or domestic colonialism as a mode of analyzing Black America. So if we look at just here, beyond perception, the all-pervasive environment of mass media today, the United States is pretty much a collective of not only private corporations, but private corporations that are highly involved in one aspect of their apparatus or another in the production of media. All the media that we see, read, hear, get on the internet or use the internet to get access to are controlled and owned by really just a handful of corporations, all of which have interlocking relationships, making that that community really very small. They're able to dominate and lock down our ways of thinking and how we interpret our reality and so on. And then, as Marshall McLuhan said, they create a condition where we don't know who discovered the ocean, but he said we know it was not the fish, because an all-pervasive environment is all but undetectable. It goes beyond perception. And this is what we're dealing with here in the United States, particularly those born in the last few generations, people younger than me. They're born into a world where they're told, particularly nowadays, that we're made progress, we're advancing, we're free, everything's equal, opportunity, so on and so forth, and they don't realize the environment into which they're being raised. They don't realize the environment into which not only they're being raised, but to what extent it's being dominated by mass media, to what extent that same media is owned by a handful of people with whatever business arrangements that they do have. And just very briefly, this issue of cultural imperialism. Clifford Geertz is a very popular anthropologist, just died a couple of years ago. And one of the things that he said, like many of the great, more radical scholars, was that culture is a set of control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions for the governing of behavior. Again, to keep people in line. If you read this from the perspective of those who want to dominate, they would obviously want to be involved in cultural imperialism. And if you read the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski, aide to Obama, he said, many years ago, that media, U.S. control of mass media, is what will keep this country an empire far beyond, with the reach and life and longevity that far outpaces all other empires of the past, because media as a weapon is more powerful and more highly consolidated and controlled today than ever before. But as Chris Simpson also, as I mentioned a moment ago, said, and going back to my earlier point, Geertz also worked cheek by jowl with men whom many people consider to be professional terrorists specializing in the suppression of indigenous democracy. So again, my point, he may have been an honest, well-meaning, good progressive white dude doing great research in his book and his the one I've read. I can't even remember the title of it now, but other articles I've read is very, very important, very informative. But the point that Simpson is making here is that you don't necessarily know who or how your research will be used. So he was working with people who, again, were considered professional terrorists in private business and government who use media to suppress indigenous democracy, and would take the work of him showing you how important culture is to a community or to even an individual, and then showing you how distorting it will allow them to be manipulated in perpetuity, almost, again, beyond perception, without perception, and like I said, almost permanently. So just to tie this up very quickly to what I often end up talking about, which is hip hop, and I'm very glad to have been able to follow Sister Asada's performance here, is that the same process is carried out today. And I often use the hip hop and the music industry just to make this point very clear. But just going through this just very quickly, this is just a model that takes those ideological tenets I mentioned a few minutes ago, and shows how they're deployed in the music industry through the ownership of the art. Once you produce a song, it's owned by one of three corporations who determine how popular it will be, or whether it will be heard at all, and against which all people like Sister Asada, who was just up here performing, must struggle against if they want to be heard. Because whether or not you are in direct competition with them, or hostile, or even likely or friendly with them, the popular rappers, or in this case, popular media, popular cultural expression, are are made popular to determine the norm against which all others are measured. As I said a moment ago, we're judged not only by who we are, but who we are not. So people will often say, and I just did it the other day, a couple semesters ago, I did it the other day, but a more powerful version happened a couple semesters ago. I played a remix of a very popular song by Lil Wayne called "A Milli," which is about, whatever, millions of women, millions of drugs, millions of whatever he was doing. And I played Uno the Prophet's version, where he did a million, talking about 1 million Africans, 1 million indigenous people, hundreds of millions of people being killed and imperialized, if I could just take that big poetic license with that word, imperialized out of existence. And I played it, and one of the sisters in the classroom said, the flow was good, the same beat, obviously, but we're not conditioned. She actually said, we are not conditioned to accept that message. We are so often confronted with another message that I am now not comfortable hearing this other version, even though aesthetically and musically it is just as good. And I said, well, that's the point, because you set up a situation where Lil Wayne is heard so often that the assumption is, the recognition is that we recognize that we must like it. And this is how they get us to adopt anything from music to national anthems to pledges of allegiance and so on and so forth. So then I just start showing these basic things here about radio airplay, just to sort of make this point. The rhythmic top 30 played around the country. Again, I'm still operating off an older one here, but it still works just in terms of showing you not only how many times songs are played, but who owns them. So in this week in October of last year, Trey Songz had a song played 6,157 times across the country just in 1 week. That song is owned by Warner Music Group. And if you notice here in red, there are only 3 corporations that own all the songs in the top 10 or top 20. And they're played 6,000 times, 7,000 times a week all around the country, just on radio. This doesn't count video plays, internet plays, when they're attached to a video game or a commercial, just radio. And you see that there's no room for Sister Asada or for Head Rock or Asheru or any number of other folks. And they just play them over and over and over again. And then just to show the same thing, that even a black woman, this is why you have to understand imperialism and colonialism, that even a black woman who owns Radio 1, the largest block of radios that target black people, does the exact same thing. Same song, same corporation, same lack of news, same exact everything. So what that does is it creates a situation where, again, a standard is set, a norm is set, and everything else is judged against it. But then again, these corporations are actually subsidiaries of larger corporate entities. So Universal Music Group, which is the biggest record company in the country, in the world, in fact, is only 6%. That's 14% of Vivendi. And that, well, I won't go too much into that. But UMG, everybody talking about the music industry's dying, all this stuff. UMG's revenues went up last year. Vivendi's overall revenues went up last year. They're making plenty of money, $40 billion for Vivendi. So why would they care if they're not playing us the kind of music that will help us get free? In fact, their social and political benefit is to keep us from not thinking about freedom, because their whole broader spectrum of businesses require stability, which is what we hear so much about in terms of Libya and other parts of the world. We need stability, not freedom, stability. And we don't want, Africans running around here with their fists up is not stability. Africans running around here killing each other, perfectly stable. That's not a problem. So Sony Music, same thing for Sony Corporation. Sony Music is only 6% of Sony Corporation's overall business. Doug Morris just became the CEO there, and they said he's going to be making $10 million a year. So clearly there's not, poverty in the music industry. And they're all fighting to get these positions, by the way. I mean, he's like, there's all these people vying for these positions. Warner Music Group, the big three, Edgar Bronfman and Leo Cohen, the two top executives of that company, even while the company was losing $400 million, at least on paper, they were making $83 million. And, their losses, by the way, is when they say we project to sell 10 million CDs, we only sell 8 million, so we write it off as a $2 million loss. Okay, I'm moving through, 5 minutes. So what we don't get is the anti-sonic warfare, the music that we were just hearing a minute ago. People like Garcias, Dead Prez, Head Rock, my man Skip Coon, which is my new favorite, Skip Coon and Mr. Nick. You got to check them out if you haven't already. Some of the best out of Mississippi. And in La Tere, we don't hear people like this on the radio, because that, again, is antithetical to how propaganda works. By the way, counterintelligence program, the fifth tenet of that said specifically we have to keep black youth away from black radical politics. So there's a specific relationship between what's popular musically and politically. Daruba bin Wahad made the point about the impact of propaganda, saying that propaganda gets black activists killed. And his point was that if you put an image of us out as being hostile or violent or a threat to our own communities, then our own communities will support us getting killed and locked up. So it works in that way. So then finally, conclusion, why again propaganda, okay? As Fanon said, the settler's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. The native's work is to imagine all possible methods for destroying the settler. And I'll leave it there, and thank you very much. All right.